5 years after they told me to disappear, three black SUVs rolled through the iron gates of the Langford estate on a quiet Saturday morning. They moved slowly enough for every neighbor on Wyndham Court to stop, stare, and wonder who had arrived. The entire Langford family was waiting on the porch. Gerald stood stiff in his expensive weekend blazer. Catherine held a glass of white wine she had completely forgotten to drink. Megan froze beside them in a summer dress, her hand halfway to her lips. Sitting on the front steps was a little girl in a bright yellow dress. The moment the lead SUV came to a stop, she looked at the driver's door, smiled, and whispered, "Daddy." The door swung open. I stepped out wearing my army dress blues, captain's bars shining on my shoulders, my shoes polished so perfectly they reflected the Carolina sky. Two fellow soldiers climbed out behind me. They weren't there to make a statement or intimidate anyone. They came because they had served beside me and wanted to stand with me. Gerald Langford looked at me like he'd just seen a ghost. 5 years earlier, that same man had cornered me in a hospital hallway, pointed a finger in my face, and declared I was too poor, too damaged, and too worthless to raise my own daughter. He said the greatest favor I could ever do for her was to vanish from her life. I never did. But that story begins much earlier, with a boy from the side of town the Langfords never bothered to drive through, a girl who loved him anyway, and a wealthy family convinced love meant nothing without money behind it. My name is Kevin West. I grew up in Ridgemont, on the east side of Fayetteville, North Carolina, where the houses leaned with age, the front porches creaked, and everybody knew your business before you did. My mother, Denise West, raised me by herself. She spent her mornings working in a hospital laundry, her evenings answering phones at a property management office, and somehow still found the strength to make sure I finished my homework, ate dinner at the kitchen table, and learned the lessons she repeated almost every day while folding towels with tired hands that never stopped moving. Kevin, nobody is going to hand you anything. That's not unfair. That's life. But whatever you earn is something nobody can ever take away. I didn't fully understand those words at 17, but I believed them because she lived them every single day. Every paycheck, every bill she paid, every ounce of respect she earned came through hard work, and I never once heard her complain. I never knew my father. He walked away before I was old enough to remember his face. My mother never criticized him. She simply erased him from the conversation, and that silence taught me more than words ever could. Silence can say more than 1,000 excuses. I met Megan Langford during my junior year of high school, and in less than a minute she changed the direction of my life. She was a sophomore who had transferred from an elite private school across town because, as she later admitted, she wanted to meet real people. Coming from anyone else, I probably would have rolled my eyes. But Megan wasn't pretending. She was sitting cross-legged on the bleachers at a football game she barely watched, eating cheese fries with her fingers and laughing at her own terrible jokes. She was stunning. But that wasn't what pulled me in. It was the way she listened. When you spoke, she leaned forward like nothing else in the world mattered. She treated everyone that way, the lunch lady, the janitor humming gospel songs in the hallway, the shy kid who stuttered through every English presentation. She made people feel seen. For someone who had spent most of his life feeling invisible, that kind of attention was impossible not to fall for. We started dating that winter, and for the next 2 years, life felt exactly the way first love is supposed to feel. Simple, exciting, and full of hope. Then I met her parents. The Langfords lived behind the gates of Wyndham Court, in a neighborhood I hadn't even known existed until Megan gave me the address. The houses sat so far from the road they looked like they wanted nothing to do with the outside world. Every lawn was trimmed to perfection, every driveway spotless. Gerald Langford was a senior partner at one of the largest commercial real estate firms in the Southeast. His handshake told me everything before he said a word. It was the grip of a man who judged people in seconds and rarely changed his mind. Catherine Langford came from old Raleigh money, the kind of family that donated hospital wings and had portraits hanging inside country clubs. Together they had built a life that looked flawless from every angle. My first dinner with them was a disaster disguised as good manners. Gerald greeted me at the door, shook my hand a second longer than necessary, then quietly looked me over from head to toe. His eyes lingered on my shoes, my shirt, and finally the old Honda Civic my mother had driven me there in, its dented rear bumper impossible to miss. Kevin, he said, testing my name as if it didn't belong in his house. Megan says you're from the east side. Yes, sir. And your mother works at the hospital. In the laundry department? Yes, sir. He gave a slow nod, the kind people make after they've already reached a verdict. Come in. Catherine was more welcoming on the surface, complimenting my shirt, asking about my grades, and offering me sweet tea. But every smile felt rehearsed, every kind word carefully measured. She made sure I felt comfortable without ever making me feel like I belonged. I'd spent enough time around people who had almost nothing to recognize the difference between real kindness and kindness performed for an audience. At dinner, Gerald asked what I planned to do after high school. I told him the truth. I wanted to join the army. The table fell silent. Gerald slowly set down his fork. The army, he repeated. Is that out of financial necessity or genuine interest? Both, sir. Under the table, Megan reached for my hand. I could feel the tension in her grip. Gerald gave a polite smile. There's nothing wrong with military service. It gives young men structure, especially those who don't have many other opportunities. It was the cleanest insult I'd ever heard. He never called me poor. He never said I wasn't good enough for his daughter. He simply chose his words so everyone understood exactly what he meant. I smiled, swallowed the insult, and finished my dinner. What Gerald didn't know was that one day I'd drive back up that same driveway as a man he'd never imagined I could become. Megan and I stayed together through my senior year. A week after graduation, I enlisted in the Army. That same week, her parents shipped her off to spend the summer with an aunt in Virginia, hoping distance would end what they couldn't control. It didn't. We talked every night and filled each other's mailboxes with handwritten letters because Megan said real words deserved real paper. I still have every one of those letters tucked away in a shoebox. Basic training pushed me harder than anything I'd ever faced, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't just getting by, I was becoming someone. I wasn't the strongest or the fastest. I was the one who refused to quit. One afternoon, my drill sergeant looked at me and said, West, you've got the one thing I can't teach these idiots. You keep going after everyone else is done. It sounded exactly like something my mother would have said. 6 months into my first assignment, Megan called me in tears. I'm pregnant. My whole world shifted in 2 words. The first thing I felt wasn't happiness. It was fear. I was 20 years old, earning barely enough to support myself, living in a barracks room smaller than the Langfords' guest bathroom. I thought about my mother struggling to raise me alone. I thought about the father who walked away. I thought about every story I'd ever heard of young families trapped in the same cycle. Then my mother's voice echoed in my head. The things you earn are the only things nobody can take from you. I'm not going anywhere, I told Megan. We'll figure this out. She believed me. Her parents never did. And what they did next was far worse than simply disapproving of the pregnancy. They didn't just reject me, they tried to erase me from my own child's life. One night at 11, Gerald called my phone. His voice was calm, but the anger underneath it was impossible to miss. I'm going to make this simple, Kevin. You're a 20-year-old enlisted soldier with no degree, no money, and no future my daughter should be tied to. If you care about Megan, you'll step aside and let us handle this properly. Handle it how? I asked. We'll support her. We'll make sure the baby has everything she needs. You'll be welcome to visit once in a while. Visit my own child. The words hung in the silence. Then he added, I'm offering you more than most men in your position deserve. I took a breath. With all due respect, Mr. Langford, you don't get to decide what I deserve. He hung up. It was the last respectful conversation we ever had. Lily was born on a Tuesday morning in March, weighing 7 pounds 4 ounces. She had Megan's eyes and my mother's stubborn chin. I drove 11 straight hours on emergency leave to make it in time, arriving at the hospital still wearing my uniform with a stuffed elephant I'd bought from a gas station outside Richmond, because it was the only toy I could find at 3 in the morning. Megan lay exhausted in her hospital bed, holding our daughter against her chest. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes. She looks like you, she whispered. I reached out to hold my daughter for the first time, but before I could, Gerald stepped into the doorway and blocked my path. You're not family, he said. I turned to face him. He wore the same polite expression he'd had at our first dinner. the one he used whenever he wanted to sound reasonable while saying something cruel. This is a family moment, Kevin. Megan needs rest. The baby needs stability, and you can't provide either. From behind me, Megan's weak but determined voice cut through the room. Dad, stop. Gerald ignored her. He's not a father. He's a boy wearing a uniform. In that moment, something inside me changed forever. The anger disappeared, replaced by something colder. I realized this man would spend the rest of his life trying to convince my daughter that I was nothing. I also realized I would never prove him wrong by arguing with him. I'd prove it by becoming the man he insisted I could never be. I held Lily for 20 precious minutes that morning while Gerald stood outside the room with his arms crossed, watching me like I was holding something that belonged to him. It would be almost 3 months before I got to hold my daughter again. The next 5 years became a war fought in courtrooms instead of battlefields. Custody fights, blocked phone calls, missed birthdays, and endless legal delays designed to wear me down until I finally gave up. Those years still haunt me, but they also forged the man who would one day drive back through the Langfords' front gate. While they tried to shut me out, I buried myself in the army. Every training course, every deployment, every leadership opportunity, I took them all. Not because I loved the hardship, but because every promotion brought me one step closer to building the future they swore I'd never have. Every qualification I earned gave me more than a promotion. It gave me proof. Proof that the kid Gerald Langford had written off as worthless was becoming someone he could never ignore. My first deployment took me to Afghanistan. 9 months in Helmand Province, where the heat felt like it was crushing you from the inside and every road carried the possibility that you might not come home. I won't pretend I can explain combat to someone who hasn't lived it. Some experiences don't fit into sentences, but I can tell you what it changed in me. I learned that courage isn't about having no fear. It's choosing to protect someone else, even when you're afraid. I learned leadership isn't about the rank on your uniform. It's about whether the person standing beside you trusts you enough to follow you when the situation turns dangerous. And I learned that the people who brag the loudest about being tough are usually the ones who disappear when toughness is actually required. During those months, I thought about Gerald Langford more than once. Not with anger. Something calmer. I realized he'd spent his entire life using money to control situations and had confused that control with strength. But real strength wasn't sitting behind a desk with a powerful title. Real strength was holding pressure on a wounded friend's leg while chaos exploded around you. It had nothing to do with the size of your bank account. Back home, things with Megan became harder. Not because we stopped loving each other, but because she was trapped inside a world where her family treated our relationship like a problem that needed to be eliminated. Megan tried. I knew she did. She sent pictures of Lily, arranged video calls whenever her parents weren't around, and fought with Gerald behind closed doors. I heard pieces of those arguments through the phone, Megan's voice breaking with frustration, Gerald's voice steady and unchanging. But money creates a kind of gravity. When your parents pay your bills, your car insurance, your daughter's preschool, and every part of your life, leaving them doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like stepping into the unknown with nothing to catch you. Megan stayed in their world, not because she didn't love me, but because she didn't know how to escape it. On paper, custody was shared. In reality, it depended on what Gerald's lawyers could delay, challenge, or negotiate. I got Lily every other weekend when I wasn't deployed, but sometimes those weekends turned into months apart. Every time I arrived to pick her up, Gerald stood on the porch watching me place my daughter in the car. He looked at me like I was borrowing something expensive that he expected me to damage. He never asked where we were going, never wished us well. He just stood there with the quiet belief that my place in Lily's life was temporary. But I kept showing up. I always would. Lily grew into a beautiful, curious little girl with Megan's eyes, my mother's stubbornness, and a laugh that could brighten an entire room. Every other weekend, I took her to the same park near my apartment. She loved the wooden bridge over the creek, where she'd toss rocks into the water and watch the circles spread. One afternoon, when she was 5, she sat beside me on that bridge, swinging her little legs over the edge, and asked a question so quietly I almost missed it. Daddy, why don't Grandma and Grandpa want to see me when I'm with you? I looked at my little girl, barely 5 years old, already carrying pain she never should have known. I swallowed everything I felt and gave her the only answer I could. They love you very much, because no matter what they did to me, I would never make my daughter carry the weight of their mistakes. Gerald and Catherine loved Lily the only way they knew how, with money, rules, and control. But they don't like you, she said. It wasn't a question. It was something she'd already figured out. I looked at my daughter and searched for the right words. Sometimes people have trouble accepting what they don't understand. She stayed quiet for a moment, then leaned against my arm and threw another rock into the creek. Do you understand me better than anyone in the world? She asked. Yes. Good, she said. Because I understand you too. A 5-year-old girl's words stayed with me for years. They carried me through every difficult day that followed. By the time Lily turned 6, I had earned 2 promotions. By 7, I had completed officer candidate school, one of the toughest challenges the Army offered and one of the proudest moments of my life. I called my mother the day I put on my lieutenant bars. She cried for several minutes before finally saying the words I had heard my entire life. I told you, they can't take away what you earn. 6 months later, I lost her. Pancreatic cancer took her quickly, the kind of disease that often arrives too late to fight. She passed away on a Thursday evening in October, with me holding her hand as the last sunlight faded through her hospital window. 3 days later, I found the letter she'd left behind. It was inside the same shoebox where I kept Megan's old letters. Her handwriting shook, but her message was stronger than ever. Kevin, by the time you read this, I'll finally be somewhere I can't bother you anymore. So listen carefully. You were never poor. You were just broke. And those are 2 completely different things. Being broke is a circumstance. Circumstances change, but a poor mindset only changes when you're brave enough to fight it. The people who underestimate you are giving you the greatest advantage. They give you time to build while they're too busy believing you're nothing. Don't waste that gift. And please remember to eat breakfast. You always forget breakfast. I love you. I'm proud of you. Now go become the man I already know you are. I sat alone in her empty kitchen and cried until I couldn't cry anymore. Then I stood up, made breakfast, and went back to work. Over the next 2 years, I built a life so far beyond Gerald Langford's expectations that his biggest mistake became believing he already knew my limits. And one day, I would drive back through the gates of Wyndham Court and force him to see the truth. But before that moment came, there was one battle left to fight: the courtroom. When Lily turned 7, I filed for true joint custody. Not the arrangement where my name was on paper, but my role as a father was reduced to scheduled visits. I finally had the resources to hire a real attorney, not a Langford-level firm, but a talented family law specialist named Teresa Morales. She wasn't intimidated by wealth, and that was exactly why I chose her. Her first words to me were simple. The court doesn't care about your rank or their money. It cares about one thing: what's best for Lily. Our job is to prove that having her father in her life is part of that. Gerald responded by hiring Whitfield, the most expensive family attorney in the area. He wore designer suits, spoke with perfect confidence, and had a talent for making even unfair arguments sound reasonable. The hearing lasted 2 days. Whitfield painted the Langford household as a perfect world: private schools, piano lessons, financial security, and grandparents who loved their granddaughter. Then he painted me as the opposite: a well-intentioned soldier who was constantly away, constantly deployed, and unable to provide the stability a young girl needed. Teresa tore their argument apart, piece by piece. She showed the court my deployment records, the child care plans I created, the family support arrangements, and the backup guardianship plans I had prepared before every assignment. She showed my promotion history. Then she brought in my commanding officer, who looked directly at the judge and said, "Captain West is the most reliable man I've ever served with. If he says he'll be there for his daughter, he'll be there." Then came the evidence Gerald couldn't explain away: the phone records. 14 months of blocked calls. 23 unanswered requests for more time with Lily. 6 denied birthday and holiday visits with no reason given. And finally, 1 email Gerald had sent to Megan. Teresa read it aloud in the courtroom. "The less contact Lily has with him now, the easier the transition will be later. Children forget. That's a kindness." The courtroom went silent. The judge slowly looked up from her bench. She was in her 60s, with years of experience written across her face. She had heard every excuse families could create, and she wasn't interested in hearing another one. She turned toward Gerald, sitting behind his attorney. Mr. Langford, explain to this court why a father with an excellent military record, no criminal history, and proven financial stability was repeatedly denied access to his own child. Gerald stood and adjusted his blazer, the same way he always did when he believed he still controlled the room. Your Honor, our only concern has been Lily's stability. Captain West's lifestyle, his deployments, his relocations. The judge cut him off. I did not ask about your opinion of his lifestyle. I asked why access to his daughter was denied. Those are two different questions. Please answer the one I asked. Gerald opened his mouth. Then he stopped. For the first time, I saw the man who always had a perfect response lose his words completely. The ruling came the following week. Full joint custody. Equal time. No blocked calls. No unnecessary interference. The judge's written decision included a paragraph I read so many times I memorized every word. The court finds no evidence that Captain West's military service has diminished his ability or commitment as a father. Instead, the evidence shows a pattern of deliberate obstruction by the maternal grandparents, whose financial influence over the mother has contributed to limiting the father's role. This court does not consider wealth a qualification for parenting, nor poverty a disqualification. I sat alone in my car outside the courthouse and read that paragraph again and again. Then I called the voicemail I had kept active for my mother, paying the monthly bill just so I could still hear her voice. I told her we won. But that victory wasn't the moment everything changed. The courtroom gave me my rights back. It gave me time with my daughter. But it couldn't give me the one thing I truly wanted, the moment when the Langfords finally understood who they had underestimated. That moment came years later, in their driveway. Respect from the people who once believed you would never earn it. That was the thing money could never buy. The morning I returned to Wyndham Court to pick up Lily under the new custody order was the first time I'd stepped onto that property since the hospital room years earlier. I could have gone alone, signed the papers, put my daughter in the car, and left. But two men I served with in Afghanistan, Sergeants Rivera and Jackson, were visiting me that week. They were the kind of men who had carried wounded soldiers through places I still struggle to talk about. When I told them where I was going, Rivera didn't hesitate. We're coming with you. I shook my head. You don't have to. He looked at me and smiled. You spent 3 years making sure we came home. We're making sure you get your daughter. Jackson didn't say a word. He just grabbed his keys and headed for the car. Because Rivera's truck was being repaired, and Jackson refused to leave his own vehicle behind, we ended up taking 3 black SUVs. That was how we rolled through the iron gates of Wyndham Court on a Saturday morning while neighbors watered their lawns and tried not to stare. I want to make one thing clear. This wasn't a display of power. It wasn't meant to intimidate anyone. It was simply 3 soldiers showing up for one another the same way we always had. The fact that it looked like a scene from a movie was just coincidence. The fact that Gerald Langford was shaken by it was something I didn't mind. The entire Langford family stood on the porch. Gerald's expression changed in seconds. First confusion, then recognition, then something I had never seen from him before, uncertainty. For years, he had controlled every situation around him. That morning, he faced something he couldn't predict. Catherine slowly placed her wine glass on the railing. Megan wasn't looking at the SUVs or my uniform. She was looking at me, and in her eyes, I saw something change. Maybe for the first time in years, she wasn't seeing the boy her father had dismissed. She was seeing the man that boy had become. Then I saw Lily. My little girl sat on the porch steps wearing a yellow dress. The second she saw me step out of the SUV, her entire face changed. Daddy. She ran across the lawn barefoot, and I dropped to my knees to catch her. I had imagined that moment through every deployment, every lonely night in a barracks, every time I held her picture and reminded myself I had to come home. She wrapped her arms around my neck. You're wearing your fancy clothes. I smiled. Special occasion. She looked at me with those big eyes. Is it because of me? Everything is because of you. Behind her, Gerald Langford watched his granddaughter hold on to the man he once said was nothing. Rivera and Jackson stood silently beside the SUVs, hands behind their backs. They didn't need to say anything. Their presence told the whole story. I carried Lily toward the car, and when I reached the porch, I stopped. For years, I had imagined that moment. I had rehearsed the speech I'd give Gerald, the anger, the pain, the words I'd waited years to say. But standing there with my daughter in my arms, I realized I didn't need revenge. I only needed the truth. Mr. Langford, I looked him in the eyes. You told me once I wasn't in a position to provide for my daughter. I want you to know something. I never stopped providing for her. Not once. Even when you made it as difficult as you possibly could. I paused. The difference between us was never money. You measured a father's worth by what he could afford. I measured mine by whether my daughter knew I would always come back for her. Gerald said nothing. His jaw tightened as he searched for a response that never came. Catherine looked away. Megan's eyes filled with tears. And for the first time, Gerald Langford had no words left. She always knew, Megan said softly from the porch. I looked back at her. There was no anger left between us, no relationship to rebuild, only a daughter we both loved, and a past too complicated to fix in one moment. But those two words were enough. She always knew. I wish I could say Gerald Langford apologized that day. He didn't. Men like Gerald rarely change through one emotional speech or one dramatic confession. They change slowly, through small decisions repeated over time. The first Thanksgiving after the custody ruling, Gerald called me. Not Megan. Me. His voice sounded different. Stiff. Uncomfortable. Like a man stepping into unfamiliar territory. Lily wants you to come to dinner. I paused. Do you want me there? Silence. Then he answered quietly. I think it's important for her to have her family together. It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was a door opening, and I had learned something important about life. When a door finally starts moving, you don't have to break it down. I went. This time, I wore a suit instead of my uniform. I brought a bottle of wine I probably couldn't afford, and a sweet potato pie made from my mother's recipe, the same one she made when we had very little money, but more than enough love. Dinner was uncomfortable, the way all first steps are after years of damage. But something was different. Gerald asked about my work, and for once it wasn't an interrogation. It was genuine curiosity. Catherine complimented the pie, then quietly took a second slice when she thought nobody noticed. Lily sat between Megan and me, talking nonstop about kindergarten, completely unaware of the tension adults had spent years creating. After dinner, Gerald found me alone on the back porch. I owe you something, he said, staring out at the yard. You don't owe me anything, I replied. I owe you an explanation. He stood there silently for a long time. Then he finally spoke. When Megan brought you home, I saw every fear I'd ever had about her future. Not because of who you were, but because of where you came from. He looked down. What most people don't know is that I started with nothing, too. I built everything from a used desk and an old phone book. But after that, I spent 30 years terrified of losing it all. He looked at me. When I looked at you, I didn't see a bad person. I saw the version of myself I was trying to forget. And I was so afraid my daughter would end up living the life I escaped that I tried to remove anyone who reminded me of it. He paused, including you. For the first time, Gerald Langford admitted the truth. I was wrong. It wasn't a dramatic apology. There was no audience, no tears, no attempt to make himself look better. Just two men standing on a porch, one finally honest enough to say what the other had known all along. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Gerald said. I'm not sure I can yet, I answered honestly. But I'm here, and I'll keep showing up. That's all I can promise. He nodded slowly. Maybe that was enough, because forgiveness isn't something you demand. It's something people earn through consistent actions and honest moments. A few weeks later, Lily and I were back at our old park, sitting on the wooden bridge and throwing rocks into the creek like we had done since she was little. Daddy. Yeah, baby? Grandpa talks about you differently now. I looked at her. Different? How? She thought carefully, the way children do when they're trying to explain something adults struggle to understand. Before, he talked about you like you were a problem. Now, he talks about you like you're a person. I laughed. Sometimes kids can explain things in one sentence that adults spend years trying to understand. That's progress, I told her. What's progress? She asked. It's when things start getting better, even if they aren't perfect yet. She threw another rock into the creek and watched the ripples spread. I think progress is good. So do I. I looked at my daughter sitting beside me. She had Megan's eyes, my mother's stubbornness, and something completely her own that I couldn't describe but instantly recognized. It was the same feeling I had driving through those iron gates years earlier. Not victory, not revenge, something stronger. The quiet certainty that I had earned my place, and no amount of money, judgment, or fear could ever take it away. People sometimes ask if I regret the years I lost, the blocked calls, the missed birthdays, the months after Lily was born when I couldn't hold her, the moment Gerald stood in that hospital doorway and told me I wasn't family. I'd be lying if I said those memories don't hurt. They do. Some wounds become scars, and scars don't vanish just because you've learned to live with them. But resentment is a chain. It keeps you connected to the people who hurt you, forcing you to keep walking around the same pain forever. I watched my mother live her entire life without carrying that weight. I watched her leave this world peaceful, proud, and certain of the person she had raised. She was right all along. The things you earn are the only things nobody can take from you. Circumstances can change, but only when you have the courage to change yourself first. And the people who underestimate you are often giving you the greatest advantage. They give you time to become someone they never expected while they're too busy believing you can't. I'm 31 years old now. I'm a captain in the United States Army. My daughter knows my voice, my face, and one promise I have never broken: I will always come back for her. Every other weekend, I drive into Wyndham Court to pick Lily up. Gerald Langford still walks onto that porch. He still nods at me. And sometimes, not every time, but sometimes he says something that almost sounds like respect. We aren't where we should be yet, but we're closer than we were. And according to Lily, progress is good. If this story reminded you of someone who was underestimated before they had the chance to prove themselves, a father, a single parent, or anyone who was told they weren't enough, share your thoughts below and tell me which moment stayed with you the most. And if you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Sweet Family Revenge for more stories about family, betrayal, and the people who find the strength to rise above it all. Because sometimes the greatest victory isn't making everyone admit they were wrong. It's becoming someone who no longer needs their approval.